June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Combat medic Thomas Reid ran into hell with nothing but bandages and morphine. He was 22 years old. He'd been trained to save lives, to patch wounds, to get men back to the aid station alive. By the end of that day, he'd treated 47 wounded soldiers on that blood-soaked beach. Only 12 survived. But it wasn't the 35 men who died that haunted Thomas Reid for the rest of his life. It was the one he chose not to save, the soldier he walked past, the kid who was still breathing, still conscious, still begging for help. Thomas looked at him, made a calculation, and kept walking. That decision would destroy him. This is the story of what happened on Omaha Beach, not from a soldier's perspective, but from the man who had to decide who lived and who died, the medic who carried that weight for 50 years, until the day he finally told the truth. Thomas Michael Reid was born in 1922 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of a steelworker, middle child of 5, grew up in a 2-bedroom row house where everyone shared everything and nobody had much. Thomas was smart, really smart, graduated high school at 16, got accepted to the University of Pittsburgh on a partial scholarship, started pre-med in the fall of 1938. He wanted to be a doctor, wanted to help people, wanted to escape the steel mills that had broken his father's back and killed his grandfather at 49. But in December 1941, Pearl Harbor happened. Thomas was 19, still in college. He could have gotten a deferment. Medical students were exempt from the draft. He could have finished his degree, become a doctor, served that way. But Thomas didn't wait for the draft. He enlisted in January 1942. His mother cried when he told her. His father nodded and shook his hand. His younger brothers thought he was a hero. Thomas didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he was doing what needed to be done. The Army saw his pre-med training and assigned him to the Medical Corps, not as a doctor, as a combat medic. The men who ran onto battlefields while everyone else was running off them. The men who crawled through machine gun fire to reach wounded soldiers. The men who had the worst job in the entire war. Thomas completed medic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. 8 weeks of intensive instruction. How to stop bleeding, how to treat shock, how to splint broken bones, how to inject morphine, how to identify who could be saved and who was already gone. That last part was called triage. In a mass casualty situation, a battle, an artillery barrage, a disaster, medics had to make fast decisions. The Army taught them a simple system. Immediate. Critical wounds but savable if treated now. Priority 1. Delayed. Serious wounds but stable. Can wait for treatment. Priority 2. Expectant. Mortal wounds. Going to die no matter what you do. Priority 3. That last category, expectant, was the hardest, because it meant looking at a wounded soldier, assessing his injuries, and deciding, this man is going to die. I'm not going to waste time trying to save him when I could save someone else instead. It meant walking away from a man who was still breathing, still conscious, still begging you not to leave him. It meant making a choice that would haunt you forever. The instructors at Fort Sam Houston told the medics, you can't save everyone. Don't try. Save the ones you can. Move on from the ones you can't. That's the job. Thomas Reid understood the logic. He just didn't know if he could actually do it. Not until June 6, 1944. Thomas shipped out to England in March 1944. He was assigned to the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, the same division that would hit Omaha Beach in the first wave of D-Day. For 3 months, the men trained on the English coast, practiced amphibious landings, stormed fake beaches, ran through scenarios. The officers didn't tell them where they were going, but everyone knew, everyone could feel it. Something big was coming. Thomas made friends during those months, other medics, soldiers from his unit, young men from all over America who'd been thrown together by the war. There was Eddie Kowalski from Chicago, a rifleman, loud, funny, always cracking jokes. There was James Hartley from Georgia, quiet, serious, carried a Bible everywhere. There was Michael Chen from San Francisco, first-generation Chinese-American, barely spoke English when the war started, fluent now. And there was Billy Sullivan, 18 years old, from a small town in Iowa, looked like he should still be in high school. Billy was terrified. Everyone could see it. He threw up before every training exercise. His hands shook when he held his rifle. Thomas took Billy under his wing, talked to him, calmed him down, told him it would be okay. "When we hit the beach," Thomas said, "stay close to me. If you get hit, I'll patch you up. I won't let anything happen to you." Billy looked at Thomas with those wide, scared eyes and said, "You promise?" Thomas nodded. "I promise." That promise would become the worst thing Thomas Reid ever said. June 5, 1944, the eve of D-Day. The invasion had been postponed once already due to weather. Now the forecast showed a brief window of acceptable conditions for June 6th. General Eisenhower gave the order. "We go." That night, Thomas and the other medics gathered in their quarters. Nobody slept. They checked and rechecked their medical bags, bandages, tourniquets, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, plasma, scissors, tape, everything a medic needed to keep men alive in the middle of a battlefield. Thomas had been trained for this, drilled for this. He knew his job, but as he sat there in the darkness, listening to the engines of the ships that would carry them across the English Channel, he felt something he'd never felt before. Not fear, dread. A cold, heavy certainty that tomorrow was going to be worse than anything he could imagine. Billy Sullivan sat next to him, pale, shaking. "Tommy," Billy whispered, "I don't think I can do this." Thomas put a hand on Billy's shoulder. "Yes, you can. What if I freeze up? What if I get scared and I can't move? Then you get down, you stay down, and you wait for it to pass, and I'll be there. Remember?" Billy nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Thomas wished he could say something more, something reassuring, something that would make Billy feel safe. But there was nothing to say, because tomorrow they were going to storm the most heavily defended beach in Europe, and a lot of them weren't coming back. June 6, 1944, 0300 hours. The men of the 116th Infantry were loaded into Higgins boats, flat-bottomed landing craft designed to carry 30 soldiers from ship to shore. Thomas Reid was in Boat 6, 30 men, packed shoulder to shoulder. Rifles, packs, gear, fear. The boat engines roared to life. The fleet of landing craft pulled away from the transport ships and headed toward the French coast. It was still dark. The ocean was rough. Waves crashed over the sides of the boat. Men vomited, some from seasickness, some from terror. Thomas gripped his medical bag and stared at the ramp at the front of the boat. In a few minutes, that ramp would drop, and he would charge into whatever hell was waiting on the other side. Pause, building dread. As dawn broke, Thomas could see the coastline of Normandy. Cliffs, bluffs, a thin strip of beach, and above it all, concrete bunkers bristling with German machine guns. The naval bombardment had been supposed to destroy those defenses. The bombers had been supposed to crater the beach and knock out the German positions. But as Thomas stared at those cliffs, he could see the bunkers were still intact. The Germans were still there, waiting. At 0630 hours, the first wave hit Omaha Beach. Thomas's boat was in the second wave, scheduled to land 5 minutes later. From half a mile out, he could hear it. The sound of machine guns, explosions, screaming. The first wave was getting slaughtered. Billy Sullivan was next to Thomas, eyes wide, breathing fast. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Eddie Kowalski was praying in Polish. James Hartley clutched his Bible. Michael Chen stared straight ahead, stone-faced. Thomas Reid checked his medical bag one last time. Bandages, morphine, tourniquets. He was ready. He wasn't ready. At 06:35, Boat 6 hit the beach. The ramp dropped. Machine gun fire ripped into the boat instantly. The first 3 men fell before they even stepped into the water. Dead. Just gone. "Go, go, go!" someone screamed. Thomas jumped into the water. It was over his head. His pack dragged him down. He kicked, thrashed, fought for the surface. His boots hit sand. He stumbled forward. The water was chest deep. Bullets zipped through the air. Explosions erupted in the surf. Men were falling everywhere, screaming, drowning, bleeding. Thomas pushed forward, 30 feet to the beach, 20 feet. An explosion to his left, a mine. 3 soldiers disintegrated, 10 feet. Thomas threw himself onto the sand behind a steel beach obstacle, a hedgehog, a tangle of metal beams designed to stop tanks. He pressed himself flat. Bullets pinged off the metal above his head. He was alive. For now. Thomas looked around, bodies everywhere. In the water, on the sand, floating. Still. But some were moving, wounded, calling for medics. "Medic! Medic!" The cry went up from a dozen places at once. This was it. This was his job. Thomas grabbed his medical bag and ran. The first soldier Thomas reached had taken shrapnel to both legs. Femoral artery hit, blood pumping out in spurts. Tourniquet, fast, above the wound, tighten until the bleeding stops. Thomas worked. His hands moved on autopilot. Training took over. Tourniquet on, sulfa powder on the wound, bandage, morphine. "You're okay," Thomas told him. "Stay down. Medics will get you out." He moved to the next man. Chest wound, sucking chest wound, lung punctured, bubbles of blood with every breath. Occlusive dressing, seal the wound, keep air from getting into the chest cavity. Thomas slapped the dressing on, taped it. Morphine. "Breathe slow, in through your nose. You're gonna make it." Next man. Arm blown off at the elbow. Tourniquet, pressure, morphine. Next man. Gut shot, intestines visible. Nothing Thomas could do here except morphine and move on. Next man. Head wound, skull visible. Dead, already gone. Next, next, next. Thomas worked for hours. He lost track of time, lost track of how many men he treated. The beach was chaos, explosions, gunfire, smoke so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Bodies piled up at the waterline. The tide came in red. Thomas's uniform was soaked in blood. His hands were slick with it. His medical bag was nearly empty, but he kept moving, kept working, because that's what medics did. You didn't stop until there was no one left to save. Then Thomas heard it. A voice, weak, desperate. "Tommy, Tommy, help." Thomas froze. He knew that voice. Billy Sullivan. Thomas turned around. 50 feet away, near the base of the bluff, Billy was lying in the sand. He'd been hit. Thomas could see the blood, a lot of it. Billy was trying to sit up, failing, collapsing back down. "Tommy, please." Thomas started toward him. Then he heard another voice, closer, louder. "Medic! Medic! Oh God, please, medic!" Thomas looked. 20 feet to his left, a soldier, Thomas didn't know his name, had been hit by an artillery shell. Legs shredded, massive bleeding. But his torso was intact. His vitals were okay. Thomas could save him. Tourniquets on both legs, pressure, plasma. He could stabilize this man and get him to the aid station. He looked back at Billy. Billy was 50 feet away, through open ground, machine gun fire sweeping the area every few seconds. And Billy's wound, from this distance, Thomas could see it was bad, really bad. Gut shot, maybe worse. The impossible choice. 4 seconds. Thomas Reid stood there on Omaha Beach, and in that moment, he had to make a decision. The training kicked in. Triage. The nameless soldier 20 feet away, immediate. Critical wounds, but savable if treated now. Billy Sullivan, 50 feet away, expectant. Mortal wound. Probably going to die even if Thomas reached him. The math was simple. Save the one you can save. Move on from the one you can't. That's the job. Pause. Devastating. 3 seconds. Thomas looked at Billy one more time. Billy's eyes found his. Even from 50 feet away, Thomas could see the hope in them, the trust. "You promised," Billy had said. "You promised you wouldn't let anything happen to me." Thomas Reid made his choice. He turned away from Billy Sullivan, and he ran to the other soldier. If Thomas Reid's story is affecting you, if you're feeling the weight of that impossible choice, then you understand why the Letter Archive exists. We tell the stories that don't make it into history books, the brutal truths, the decisions that haunt men for the rest of their lives. Subscribe, because these voices, these truths, deserve to be remembered. Now let's continue, because what happened next is even harder to hear. Thomas worked on the nameless soldier, tourniquets on both legs, pressure on the worst wounds, plasma line in his arm, morphine. It took 8 minutes. 8 minutes of focused, frantic work. The soldier stabilized. His breathing evened out. His color improved. "You're okay," Thomas told him. "Hang on. They'll get you out." Thomas stood up. His hands were shaking. His medical bag was almost empty. He looked toward where Billy had been. Billy wasn't moving anymore. Thomas ran. He crossed that 50 feet faster than he'd ever run in his life. Bullets cracked overhead. He didn't care. He dropped to his knees next to Billy. Billy's eyes were open, staring at the sky, not blinking. Thomas checked for a pulse. Nothing. He checked Billy's wound. Massive trauma to the abdomen, liver, spleen, maybe more. There was nothing Thomas could have done, even if he'd gone to Billy first, even if he'd had all the time in the world. Billy Sullivan was dead the moment that shell fragment hit him. Realization said Thomas had made the right choice. Triage said he'd done his job correctly. The Army would say he'd saved a life by choosing the savable soldier over the unsavable one. But none of that mattered, because Thomas Reid had looked Billy Sullivan in the eyes, and he'd turned away. He'd broken his promise. And now, Billy was dead. Thomas survived D-Day. He treated 47 wounded men on Omaha Beach that day. 12 survived, 35 died. Billy Sullivan was number 36. Thomas never talked about it. Not to the other medics, not to his commanding officers, not in the letters he sent home to his family. He just kept working, kept treating wounded soldiers, kept doing his job. The 29th Division pushed inland. Thomas was with them. Normandy, St. Lo, the Siegfried Line, the Battle of the Bulge. Thomas treated hundreds of wounded men over the next year, saved dozens of lives. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, the medic who ran into enemy fire to save soldiers. Everyone called him a hero. Thomas didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd left Billy Sullivan to die alone on a beach in France. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was over. Thomas Reid came home to Pittsburgh in June 1945. His family threw him a party. His father shook his hand and said he was proud. His mother cried happy tears. His brothers wanted to hear war stories. Thomas smiled. Told them a few sanitized versions. Left out the blood and the screaming and Billy Sullivan. Everyone told Thomas he should go back to college, finish his pre-med degree, become the doctor he'd always wanted to be. Thomas couldn't do it. He'd seen too much, done too much. He couldn't go back to classrooms and textbooks and pretending the world made sense. He got a job at a steel mill, the same mill where his father worked, the same mill he'd wanted to escape. He married a woman named Helen in 1947, had 2 children, bought a small house in the suburbs. He lived a normal life, but he couldn't sleep. Every night, Thomas had the same dream. He's back on Omaha Beach. Billy Sullivan is calling for him. "Tommy, help me, please." Thomas runs toward Billy, but the beach stretches longer. 50 feet becomes 100, 1,000. He runs and runs, but never gets closer. Billy keeps calling. "You promised, you promised." Then Billy stops moving. His eyes go empty, and Thomas wakes up. This went on for years, decades. Thomas never told anyone. Not Helen, not his children, not the veterans he'd meet at VFW halls. He carried it alone. The guilt, the what-ifs, the certainty that he'd made the wrong choice. What if he'd gone to Billy first? What if Billy had been savable? What if Thomas had just been a coward who chose the easier patient? The questions never stopped. Thomas Reid was 72 years old, retired, grandchildren, a life most people would call successful. But the nightmares never stopped. Helen had died the year before. Cancer. Thomas was alone in the house they'd shared for 47 years, and the guilt was crushing him. One night, in the darkness of his bedroom, Thomas Reid broke down. He cried for the first time since 1944. Sobbed, couldn't stop, because he couldn't carry it anymore. The next morning, Thomas called the VA, asked if there were any counselors who specialized in combat trauma. They connected him with a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Ironically, she had the same last name as Billy Sullivan's mother. Thomas started therapy. For the first time in 50 years, he talked about D-Day, about the wounded men, about the choices he'd made, about Billy Sullivan. Dr. Mitchell listened to Thomas's story. All of it, every detail. When he finished, she asked him a question. "Thomas, do you believe you made the right choice that day?" Thomas hesitated. "The training said I did. Triage said I did. I'm not asking what the training said. I'm asking what you believe." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "No, I should have gone to Billy first. He was my friend. I promised him. And I broke that promise." Dr. Mitchell nodded. "Why do you think you didn't go to him?" "Because I was afraid. The other soldier was closer, safer, easier. Billy was 50 feet away through open fire. I was scared." "So you think you chose based on fear, not on medical judgment?" "Yes." Pause. The revelation. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward. "Thomas, I need you to hear something. You made the right choice." Thomas stared at her. "No, I abandoned. You made the right choice," she repeated. "Not because the training said so. Because you saved a man's life. A man who lived because of you. A man who went home to his family because you chose him. But Billy was going to die no matter what you did. You know that. You saw the wound. You assessed it. He was expectant. The math was clear. But I promised him. You promised to try. And you did. You treated 47 men that day, Thomas. You saved 12 lives. 12 men who came home because of you. You've been punishing yourself for 50 years for making the right choice under impossible circumstances. You've been carrying guilt for a decision that saved a life." Thomas shook his head. "It doesn't feel right. It's not supposed to feel right. That's the cost. That's what war does. It puts good men in situations where every choice is terrible, where doing the right thing still breaks you." Dr. Mitchell paused. "You didn't fail Billy Sullivan. The war failed him. The generals who sent him there failed him. The world that made that war necessary failed him. But you did your job. You saved the ones you could save. And you've been punishing yourself for 50 years for being human." After months of therapy, Thomas made a decision. He needed to know what happened to the soldier he'd saved, the nameless man he'd chosen over Billy. Thomas contacted the National Archives, started digging through D-Day records, casualty lists, medical reports. It took months. The Army's records were incomplete. Many documents had been lost or destroyed. But finally, Thomas found it. The soldier's name was Robert James Morrison, from Tennessee, age 23, hit by artillery shrapnel, both legs severely wounded, treated on Omaha Beach by a combat medic at approximately 06:45 hours, evacuated to a field hospital, survived. Pause, the revelation, 2 seconds. Thomas kept digging. Robert Morrison had returned home in 1946. Both legs saved, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He'd gotten married in 1948, had 4 children, worked as a school teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee for 35 years. He'd lived a full life because Thomas Reid had saved him. Thomas found Robert Morrison's address. He was still alive, 82 years old, living in a retirement community in Tennessee. In the summer of 1995, Thomas Reid drove to Tennessee. He knocked on Robert Morrison's door. An old man answered, gray hair, weathered face, walking cane. "Can I help you?" Robert asked. Thomas took a breath. "My name is Thomas Reid. I was a combat medic with the 116th Infantry. I think I treated you on Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Robert Morrison stared at him, silent. Then his eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life." Pause. Emotion. 3 seconds. They sat in Robert's living room for 3 hours, talked about the war, about D-Day, about what came after. Robert showed Thomas photos, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, 12 grandchildren. "All of this," Robert said, gesturing to the photos, "exists because of you. My kids, my grandkids, my 47 years of teaching, thousands of students I taught. All of it happened because you saved me that day." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 51 years. "I've been carrying guilt," Thomas said. "I chose you over another soldier, a kid named Billy Sullivan. He died while I was treating you." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your friend, but you saved me. You gave me a life. You gave my children life. You gave my grandchildren life. That's not nothing, Thomas. That's everything." Late lifting. 4 seconds. Thomas Reid returned to Pittsburgh a different man. He couldn't change what happened on Omaha Beach. He couldn't bring Billy Sullivan back. But he could finally accept the truth. He'd done his job. He'd made the right choice, even though it had nearly destroyed him. In 1997, Thomas was invited to speak at a D-Day remembrance ceremony in Normandy. He stood in front of hundreds of veterans and their families and told them the truth. He told them about Billy Sullivan, about the promise he'd broken, about the guilt he'd carried for 53 years. And he told them about Robert Morrison, about the life he'd saved, about the 12 grandchildren who existed because of a choice he'd made in 8 seconds on a beach in France. "I don't know if I made the right choice," Thomas said. "I'll never know. But I know I did my best. And I know that Robert Morrison lived because of me. That has to be enough." When Thomas finished speaking, the entire audience stood and applauded. Veterans, widows, children of men who died in the war. They understood. They understood that war doesn't give you good choices, only impossible ones. And the men who make those choices carry the weight forever. Thomas Reid died in 2003 at the age of 81. He was buried with full military honors, the Bronze Star pinned to his uniform. Robert Morrison attended the funeral. So did 3 of Robert's children and 7 of his grandchildren. They stood by Thomas's grave and thanked him for the life he'd given their father, for the family that existed because of him. Billy Sullivan is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery, Plot D, Row 18, Grave 32. Thomas visited his grave in 1997 during that trip to France. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Billy. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. But I tried. I did my best. I hope that's enough." Later, someone asked Thomas if he believed Billy would have forgiven him. Thomas thought for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but I think he would have understood, because that's what soldiers do. We understand that sometimes there are no good choices, only the ones we can live with." Thomas Reid treated over 300 wounded soldiers during World War II. He saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. But the one that haunted him was the one he couldn't save. That's the burden medics carry, not the ones they saved, the ones they couldn't. If you know a combat medic from any war, thank them, not for the lives they saved. Thank them for the weight they carry, because they remember every single one. Tomorrow, we're sharing something different, a love letter, but not the kind you expect. A Marine wrote his wife on their anniversary. June 12, 1943, Guadalcanal. He told her he almost didn't marry her, that he sat in his truck the night before the wedding considering driving away. Then she did something that changed everything. He sealed that letter, never sent it, carried it for 50 years. What was he hiding? Why couldn't he tell her? You need to hear this story. Subscribe to The Letter Archive, because every letter holds a truth someone was afraid to tell.